Dark Souls 2 doesn't know how to handle difficulty. Especially Dark Souls 2. The original. Not this one. No, we're talking about Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin here, which is better in some ways. I'll make no secret of it. I despised Dark Souls 2 when it first came out. After 30 hours of play and beating the game, I was absolutely furious, especially after how fantastic Dark Souls 1 was. I tried many times to get into Dark Souls 2, to try and mitigate my hatred of it, but it was for naught. I ignored the DLC as it came out, but I eventually caught word of Scholar of the First Sin, which sported revamped enemy placement, rebalancing, and all of the DLC that had been released up till that point. Needless to say, I was intrigued, and ultimately ended up getting it. And I like it more than the original. It's enough to salvage the experience for me, and make it enjoyable enough. Is it as well crafted as, and a masterpiece like Dark Souls 1? Hell no. But it's fair. Dark Souls 2 and Scholar of the First Sin share many of the same problems, not least of which is the story. Unlike Dark Souls 1, which used its beginning to establish the world and its major players, Dark Souls 2 instead decides to make it a personal tale about, well, I'm not really sure what, going off the intro. The intro even says it doesn't know why you're doing what you're doing. There's no established goal, and you don't know what you're looking for. Dark Souls 1 used Oscar as a sort of passing of the torch. You're not given much to go off, but you're told to ring a bell of awakening, and even if you have no idea what he's talking about, it at least gives you something to keep an ear out for. So you'll have some inkling of an idea of where you should go next. So if nothing else, it gives you direction until you find your own path. Now, I don't know about the lore and how it compares to the other entries. Couldn't be bothered to find out since both the story and world of Dark Souls 2 has persistently failed to hook me, but I can certainly say that the characters of Dark Souls 2 are lackluster. Most of them are one-note, unengaging, and basically as appealing as the game's setup. The game certainly could have made up for this in other ways. I could easily forgive this had the world design been good, but it isn't. You've probably all heard it before, or even seen it yourself, but unlike Dark Souls 1, the world doesn't connect logically, nor is it cohesive. There's seemingly no spatial relation with how the different areas connect. The most infamous example, of course, being the ride up the windmill elevator to a volcanic castle. I've heard the argument about it possibly being a narrative ploy to play to the game's themes of memory loss, and how not knowing how you got to these locations plays to that, and while I've indeed entertained that very same thought myself, it seems like more of an excuse for bad design than anything. Given this game's myriad of other flaws, it may be giving the designers and the directors a bit too much credit. Now, the poor world design isn't really a deal-breaker if there's good level design at least, but there isn't. Not in the base game, anyway. Most level design is flat, dull, lacking in shortcuts, and have a weird surplus of bonfires, even though they aren't really as necessary as they'd like you to believe. It's haphazard, that's what it is, and the same could be said for the game as a whole for the most part. Enemy and boss designs aren't much better. Most enemies and bosses in the game are simplistic and easy to read. So you'd think that the game is also very easy, and it is, since enemies in Dark Souls 2 are simplistic and easy to take down, rather than building off the one-on-one combat encounters of Dark Souls 1, where groups of enemies were only utilized for weaker mobs. Dark Souls 2 instead decides to rely on numbers to try and trick you into thinking it's difficult. Apart from some tweaks we'll get to later, the combat is still designed for one-on-one encounters. Combat design not suited to group management. To be fair, though, enemy placement is significantly better in Scholar of the First Sin than it was in the original release, save for Iron Keep, which is somehow worse. Only slightly. Boss design, as mentioned, isn't much better either. Most are humanoids with the same basic moveset and are turn-your-brain-off easy in most instances, with the only thing making them difficult being the occasionally iffy hitboxes. This isn't to say challenging enemies and bosses don't exist at all. It's just that if an enemy is difficult, it's usually obnoxiously and unfairly so in some capacity. Standard enemies aren't too bad for the most part, but this issue really rears its head in some boss fights. In the base game, this is mostly limited to the optional fights like the Royal Rat Authority, but that fight's difficulty stems more from the toxic infecting rats rather than the actual challenge of the boss itself. Didn't get footage of it, of course. I'm not subjecting myself to more of this game than I have to. I've sunk nearly 300 hours into this game over the years, so it's not as though I've never fought these before. Factoring in both the base game and DLC, I can say there are at least 2 bosses that sport a fair and enjoyable challenge, and that's Velstad the Royal Aegis and Sin the Slumbering Dragon. Begrudgingly, Fume Knight comes very close to this good boss fight sweet spot, but it's let down by being slightly too aggressive, giving the player no breathing room and wonky hitboxes, as are the norm in Dark Souls 2. On the subject of DLC, though, it's actually pretty damn good. It's the closest Dark Souls 2 ever comes to emulating the level design in Dark Souls 1. It's more complex and interwoven level design, and the areas loop into themselves, and present some interesting navigation challenges. Sanctum City is my personal favorite, and that's probably because it reminds me of Sin's Fortress. There's a lot of environmental manipulation that can change how combat encounters play out. There's traps. There's an overabundance of poison, but it's not too bad, really. The Sanctum City is probably my favorite of the 3 DLCs. Being like Sin's Fortress and sporting one of the few good boss fights in the game gives it a lot of points in my book. That said, I don't much enjoy the following DLC. Old Iron Keep is fun to navigate, but since it's more combat-oriented than Sanctum, and still maintains the same misunderstanding as to what makes Souls combat good as the base game, it's just irritating. Which is a shame, as I should like it. I think it's Fume Knight, and the other bosses that ruin it for me. Fume Knight for being obnoxious to fight, and the other 2 being locked behind combat gauntlets intended for co-op play, which of course are devoid of players at this point and possess the same misunderstanding about enemy placement as the rest of the game, but cranked up to 11. All of the DLCs sport such areas, and none of them are enjoyable. And they have terrible iteration time to boot, and that just ruins the experience. The 3rd DLC? I can't say I've beaten it. I've gotten a good ways in, but usually by that point in the game my patience with Dark Souls 2 is already worn thin. Dark Souls 2 is a long game. It's relentlessly padded in the base game alone, lacking in substance, and most of the DLC is intended for endgame, a point at which I usually find myself tired of playing through the game. I didn't even bother with the 3rd DLC this time around, thanks in part to Fume Knight killing my desire to continue. This is where I'd like to wrap up the video, but unfortunately there is more I have to complain about. The combat mechanics. Superficially, they're the same as the base as Dark Souls 1. Light and strong attacks, guarding, parrying, etc. It's all there, but it's off. The parry window is now arguably too short, possibly an overcorrection for how trivializing it was for certain enemies in Dark Souls 1. Backstabbing is now pretty much the same, functionally. For some arbitrary reason, to counter the overpowered nature of Dark Souls 1's backstabs, enemies now pivot as if on a record player to always be facing the player. It's harmless, since most enemies are trivial to deal with anyway, but it still strikes me as a haphazard solution to an admittedly noticeable problem the original had, and this solution they came up with makes the game feel worse. Another issue is dodging, for which the game is overly reliant. Shields aren't as functional as they were in Dark Souls 1, recovering time is significantly worse, and with how demanding certain bosses can be for counterattack windows, it's unreliable. Most instances, bosses will evade your attacks should you choose to attack after recovering from a guard animation, so evasion is the only reliable defensive measure through most of the game, as dodging allows you to attack immediately afterwards. Dodge fests are a problem with the series as a whole after Dark Souls 1, admittedly, but it's particularly annoying in Dark Souls 2 since your invincibility frames, or iframes, are tied directly to a stat in this game, and this game alone, which leads to either having terrible invincibility frames and dodge windows, or having obscenely overpowered evade windows if you sink too many points into it. But I guess that's neither here nor there. I guess it's an oversight. And yet another issue is the swordplay. Awkward, slow, and clunky animations that are at the same time less functional than Dark Souls 1 and nonsensical in representation. My favorite example being how the animation on the axe, or the Dragon Slayer axe at the very least, swings upwards! That's not how you swing an axe! No dimwit would do that! That misses the entire point of utilizing the weight of the axe. Yes, I know I'm being petty, but all the weapons feel about as clunky. save for the rapier. The visuals lack a unified aesthetic, which is kind of fitting considering the lack of world cohesion, and the music is more or less forgettable. But music isn't really my forte, so take that as you will. I was hoping to be a bit more positive, but writing this really brought out my lingering dislike of the game. Is Dark Souls 2 bad? Not by any stretch. It's a really good game. It just doesn't feel like a Souls game. And it probably shouldn't have been one in the first place. It feels more like a Souls-like game than a proper Soulsborne sequel. There is a very different feel between Dark Souls 2 and the rest of the Soulsborne titles. I enjoy Dark Souls 2, again, in some capacity, but coming off the back of Dark Souls 1, it's only disappointing. I'm sure I could nitpick further if I wanted to, but I'll stop here. Definitely play the other Soulsborne games over this. The Miyazaki-directed ones have a certain quality to them that this one lacks, and maybe try Dark Souls 2 sometime later down the line. Sorry to end this on a somewhat somber note, but that's just how this turned out. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe, and be sure to hit the bell icon to know when videos come out, because YouTube. I also have a Twitter, on which I'm pretty active. I post my video schedule there every so often, so if that interests you and you'd like to interact more, feel free to follow me. I hope you have a wonderful night and that this video lit a fire under you.